Hey, yo, sister students, it's Mr. Baker. Hope you're doing great. This is actually going to be our first of 2 or 3 lessons on the American Civil War. So I hope you all guys are looking forward to our study. I like to start off our discussion by asking students one of the big overarching questions, which is, do you know anything about the Civil War? Does anything come to mind? What stands out to you about the states that you see in these two maps here? Okay. And you might want to pause for just a moment and maybe jot a few things down. But when I think of the Civil War, I think of a lot of different things like the war between the states, the war to save the Union. Some people call it every so often the war of northern aggression, perhaps. But guys, at the end of the day, the point is that this is a war that there's still in the modern day a lot of emotion about. Right. So it's an important conflict that, people literally spend years and probably decades of their lives studying and writing about and certainly trying to make sense of. And we have about a week and some change to do it. So what comes to mind? To me, what comes to mind is, you hear about cousins fighting against cousins, and you hear about countrymen that are actually on different sides of the fence on certain things. But the other thing that we hear about is that there's a lot of debate, if you will, about what the causes of this war actually were. Was it a war over slavery, right? Was it a war over states' rights? Was it a conflict that, obviously involved things along the lines of economic issues, which I would argue all three of those things have ability to connect. So what's the one thing that we left off with last time, just to review, and that is the eventual election of famous President Abraham Lincoln. So guys, keep in mind, Lincoln is a household name, okay? Lincoln makes it very clear, I think in 1860, that in his view, he is not wanting to basically be a threat to the South as far as interfering with slavery where it exists. But it is a pretty foregone, statement and conclusion that the Republican Party, if you remember, guys, it was formed after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In fact, the same year as that act was passed was the year that you actually start to see the development of the Republican Party. All right, and we're going to look at a couple of things with Lincoln's election in a second. But guys, what do we notice about Lincoln? We notice a couple of really important things. First of all, remember, he's from the great state of Illinois as far as where he hung his hat most of his life. He was born in Kentucky. And he has a lot of people that he's running against in this election. Okay. So what do we notice? Again, a little bit of review, guys, from last time. What do we notice about the Democratic Party? We notice that it is divided into two factions. You're going to have the Northern Democrats, that's led by Stephen A. Douglas. Okay. And then you're going to have the Southern Democrats that are led by a gentleman by the name of John C. Breckinridge, and then also John Bell. Okay. So a lot of you guys are thinking, well, why do we have a split in the Democratic Party? A lot of that goes back to not having consistent agreement on what the platform of the party should actually be. Okay. And so they're going to split, right? They're going to have two different conventions. They're going to have two different candidates, as you can see. They're going to have two different platforms. Okay. And guys, at the end of the day, what do we notice about John Bell is, first of all, he's a name that you don't hear as much about in this election, but he did actually get a decent number of votes. The Constitutional Union Party is thinking, let's apply the Constitution to the Union the same way that we always have, which is what the Constitution says. Okay. Well, at the end of the day, Lincoln, as you can see here, guys, is going to be elected. He does not win by what I would call a landslide, but he does get the necessary number of electoral votes. He needed 152. He got 180. Okay. So you can see clearly there is a pretty strong connection with regional support for Lincoln. Now you can say, well, over here, there's a little bit of an exception. But guys, for the most part over here, you notice pretty much Lincoln and the Republican Party minus a divided New Jersey, as you can see, is actually going to take all of these votes. And so it's kind of interesting, guys. If you look at a modern day electoral college map, California has 55 electoral votes. Back in 1860, it had 4, as you can see. Okay. So therefore, what do we notice? It's obviously going to grow a lot in size and population, of course. And so what do we notice? We notice that Lincoln is only going to get 40% of the popular vote, which, keep in mind, is not what determines the outcome. That's going to be the Electoral College. But my question, guys, to all of you is, Why does this anger a lot of people that are eventually going to lead movements for secession? South Carolina, if you didn't know this, as we'll see on the future slides, guys, becomes the first state, to actually lead the Union. And for a lot of them, first of all, they see the Republican Party as a regional party. What do we mean by that? Well, kind of like what I just said, the idea that the Republicans are going to really advocate, in their view, of really representing a very dominant faction of states. Okay. And so what do we notice, guys, about this? We notice that there's going to be a lot of emphasis on the idea of, okay, we can no longer function in this union the same way that we could before. Okay. And so what happens within about a month, actually, after Lincoln is elected in early November, in December, the state of South Carolina, as you can see here, guys, became the first state to formally secede. They had a convention. They got together. They discussed it, as all the eventual seceding states did. And then they decided, December 20th, I think it was, but we'll see that on the future slide, guys, that they're going to say, okay, we cannot function like this. They saw it, guys, as a threat, because after all, what are they noticing? They see, guys, the handwriting on the wall that they can basically not win another presidential election with the North having this kind of power, right? That's one of the things that they come to the conclusion. Okay. And so at the end of the video, I'm going to show you a video, if you choose to watch it, guys. It's about 10 minutes and some change on the impact of Lincoln's election. That is worth watching if you have a few minutes. But guys, within about the next 5 months, between November and also March 4th of 1861, which is when Lincoln took office as president, as you can see here, there are 7 states, eventually 4 more, 11 total after the famous Fort Sumter incident, which I'm going to show you about in a second. Okay. And so what do we notice, guys? We notice that Lincoln does not want to really have this war, but he also is committed, again, guys, like his good friend Henry Clay, who since has passed on about 9 years before, to the concept of union. Look at what Lincoln says. And this is not the whole inaugural address or the first one, but I think it says a lot, guys. And let's ask ourselves the question, what are Lincoln's intentions here? Okay. And look at what he says. He says, I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Okay, so that's kind of confirming, hey, I don't have the power to end slavery where it currently exists. But look at what he says. I therefore consider that, in the view of the Constitution and the laws, the Union is unbroken. And to the extent of my ability, I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the states. Okay, there's a quote that comes out of, I think it's the first inaugural as well, but it's not in this passage, guys, that Lincoln says something along the lines, the mail service will continue or something. Guys, in other words, we are going to continue operating as a nation. Okay, and he kind of sees it as his job, right? His responsibility, his obligation even, to continue moving the country forward. All right, so that is his pledge. That is a really big thing. So what do we take from this? The number one thing on Lincoln's mind is the concept of union. Okay. However, we know that during the war, he's going to make some decisions that take us in a different direction. Okay. So guys, you don't have to memorize all these dates, but just to give you a little bit of context here, you'll notice that South Carolina, as I said before, becomes the first state to secede. Now you'll notice the last 4, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Those are going to be the last 4 to leave, as you can see. They are not going to leave until after the famous Fort Sumter incident, right? And so we'll look at that in just a moment. But guys, you'll notice, kind of interesting thing, you have 4 border states. And a lot of you guys might be thinking, what in the world is a border state? Well, let's go back to our map from the first slide. Okay. These border states that you can kind of see here, the ones that are in the grayish, so you got Missouri, you've got Kentucky, you've got Maryland, which is about right there, and you've also got the very small state of Delaware. All of them are border states. Why do we call them that? Well, first of all, as you can see, they border states that are part of the Union, right, or the states that actually serve in the army of the Union and serve during the war, and they also border the states that are actually going to be, as you can see, the Confederacy. Okay, which, as you can see, guys, is a pretty good sized geographic area that they're going to really have to defend. All right, so we'll look at that in one of our future lessons with the battles and the geography and things like that. Okay, but guys, what I want you to really think about is why Fort Sumter is important. So the first thing is, when we think of fort, what probably comes to mind? Exactly. We think of a fortification. It's got people there. It's got weapons. Well, guys, this is still a federal fort that is controlled by the Union of the United States. But as you can see, where is it at? It's in South Carolina. Okay, so South Carolina has already left the Union. They're already out. They're like, okay, we're out of this, this country. We're moving on. We're forming our own confederacy. All right, we'll look at that, the limitations of confederacy on our last lesson, most likely. Okay, so guys, this is a big thing. So Lincoln, as you can see, guys, has only been in office for about a month and 8 days. So literally, if you've heard the saying that you enter the frying pan or the firing range or whatever, the ground running, whatever expression you want to use for somebody who's really under pressure quick, that is Lincoln. Okay. And so what happens? Well, this is a federal fort. It's about ready to fall. It's not been fired upon yet, but it's led by actually a Kentuckian by the name of Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson was a major, I think it was. But anyway, he was a military guy, he was an officer. And so he sends word to Lincoln. And he basically says, for the most part, guys, if you want to read the document, it's out there. But he basically says to Lincoln, he goes, hey, Mr. President, we need supplies. We're on the verge of falling. We cannot sustain ourselves. He wasn't really, to my knowledge, guys, asking for a lot of weaponry, but he was asking for the necessary needs. Well, Lincoln is stuck between a rock and a hard place because he's if he does something that supports them, it's going to be seen as him overextending his boundaries by probably the Confederacy. And if he doesn't, then the argument is he's going to look like a really bad commander-in-chief, right? So in other words, he's in a tough position. What does Lincoln decide to do? You guessed it. So he goes out and he says, okay, I'm going to basically make it clear that I'm going to basically support the fort. And so he starts this process of sending aid. What happens? The Confederacy discovers the plan. April 12th of 1861, what do we notice? We have the first shots, first engagement, in other words, of this conflict. Now, I hesitate to say first battle because that's really going to be the first battle of Bull Run, which we'll look at in a few minutes. But this was basically a really important thing. Now, a lot of you guys might be wondering, okay, well, why do the other 4 Confederate states that have not left eventually leave within 5 days for the first one and then within about a month or so? And the answer is, guys, it goes back to this: Lincoln's response. All right, I want you to ask yourself the question, do you think Lincoln was right? Because he calls up, as you can see, the number isn't important, guys, to memorize, but I think it's more the principle. Did Lincoln do the right thing here? Because after all, I mean, you've been fired upon. Again, he's going to argue, as we'll see, guys, in future lessons, that the Confederacy cannot lawfully secede. According to Lincoln, it is not a constitutional action, so therefore these states are in a state of rebellion, which does warrant some action along these lines, according to Lincoln. Okay? And so what does Lincoln do? He says, okay, I need volunteers. So he calls up 75,000. But guys, remember, if you go all the way back to the 1790s, and I realize a lot of you might be thinking, well, Mr. Baker, that Whiskey Rebellion of George Washington got an army together, what was it, about 15,000, give or take? Okay, that's a very small number, 5 times less the number of what we'll see as a result of Fort Sumter. But guys, at the end of the day, states like Virginia, states like North Carolina, states like Arkansas, and also Tennessee, they're going to see this as a threat. Okay, so whether he's right or wrong, y'all can land your plane on your own on that. The one thing, guys, that we notice is that it is pretty much, at least in principle, assume that there is going to be some conflict to keep this union intact. The question, guys, is how long is the war going to be? Okay. If any of you, just a real quick story on this, guys, if any of you have actually heard of the Ken Burns series on, I think it used to be on Netflix. I don't know if it still is. It's on the Civil War. It is outstanding. It's lengthy like all of his stuff is, but it's very powerful, and it's also very worth watching if you have a chance to. I think there was an actual soldier from, I want to say it was Alabama, one of the deep southern states, that predicted incorrectly that the Civil War would be so bloodless. Okay, in other words, it would not have a lot of violence, that there would be only like a few handkerchiefs to wipe up all the blood on the battlefield. Okay, I think, guys, what we'll notice, we're not going to say a lot about battles in our lessons. We will talk about a few of the key ones and look at some geography. But, guys, if you take a look at First Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, as it's also known as, this is going to be in July 1861. Okay. And this is where famous Thomas Stonewall Jackson, as a lot of you guys might hear the story, is going to get his famous nickname. And probably one of the most well-known. He will die during the war at a battle that's called Battle of Chancellorsville. That's actually going to be a very important loss. I think it was Lee that said Jackson lost his left arm, but I lost my right arm, or something along those lines. In other words, this guy was very, very important to the cause of the Confederacy. Okay. And the fact that Virginia, I didn't point this out, guys, but really quick, the fact that Virginia left the Union was big, because Lincoln's first choice to lead the Union Army was, in fact, Robert E. Lee. Okay. But what happens, guys, is that Robert E. Lee kind of stays true to his Virginia legacy, which, of course, is statehood. Okay. Or states' rights, you could say. Okay. The outcome of the battle, First Battle of Bull Run, there's a second one. I'll show you the geography in a moment. Was it a loss? Was it a gain? The big thing, guys, that stands out to me that really is important is, first of all, Lincoln is going to learn the hard way that finding good battle leadership is not going to be something that he has a lot of success with early in this conflict. Okay. That's the first thing. And the second thing, guys, that I think this battle does is there were some people that were predicting an end to this war by Christmas time. In other words, late December of 1861. This battle, guys, definitely shares the reality that this is going to be a war that lasts longer, that has more casualties to it in the long run, etc. Okay. Now, this is kind of an interesting detail. A lot of you guys might be wondering, well, who in the world are those people? Those are spectators. Guys, those are literally people, as you can see, decked out in a lot, maybe their Sunday best. I don't know what day it was. I would assume probably a day that they were maybe attending church or something like that. But guys, these are people that could actually hear, view some of the stuff that was going on. They're, as you can see, probably having a picnic, some kind of, maybe small scale party. I cannot fathom the idea of people wanting to be that close to a battlefield. Now, I've visited the Battle of Manassas battlegrounds, and it's really cool to go to. Any of the battle sites they're worth going to. But guys, I remember sitting on one of the trees one of the areas out there, and just really trying to internalize what was going through these people's minds. All right. So anyway, kind of a neat little detail to think about. Okay. And so, yeah, here we go. So if you take a look, guys, you might want to pause the screen for just a moment. Sorry about that with the slide. And ask yourself, early in the war between First Battle of Manassas or Bull Run, and as you can see, May of 1863. Now, something to really keep in the back of our minds is that this area that we associate, guys, with this part of the war, I like to refer to this as the Eastern Campaign. Okay, so anywhere that's going to be pretty close to areas like Virginia, North Carolina, you could technically put in that category as well. Okay, maybe even as far south as Georgia, depending on your point of view. Okay, But definitely, guys, any of these battles that fall here are going to be usually what we associate with the Peninsular Campaign. Okay. And a lot of people might ask the question, why do we call it a Peninsular Campaign? Well, guys, take a look at what's going on in this area of current day, the Chesapeake area or Bay, region of Virginia. You notice that peninsular geography. Okay. This part of the war does not go really well for the Northern or the Union Army. Okay. So as you can see here, the Union forces are basically kind of like at odds. All right, you'll notice a lot of Confederate victories, a few Union victories as well. But you'll notice McClellan is going to be in charge. Guys, just really quick, Lincoln gets very, very frustrated with McClellan to a large extent because McClellan does not really have, he was a very good student at West Point and he's a pretty young guy. I'll show you his picture in a second. But the one thing, guys, that Lincoln gets frustrated with is that he does not have that go-get-'em attitude. Okay? I like to call it, those of you that remember Rocky III, the Eye of the Tiger theme song, he really does not have that killer instinct, right? And that's going to bode not well for him in Lincoln. Lincoln, guys, fires him, brings him back. Actually, in the election of 1864, if you didn't know that, McClellan is actually going to be Lincoln's opponent. You know, it makes a lot of arguments about Lincoln's management of the war and the conflict and things. Okay. And so as you can see, also another example, guys, of geography. This is what I would associate with the Western campaign. And the Southern campaign is going to be about right there. Okay. So the Western campaign, the closer you get to the Mississippi River, is the area that I would generally associate, guys, with our Western campaign. But you'll notice this is actually where you see the Union making some noise a little bit earlier in the conflict. So probably the battle that stands out the most to me is going to eventually be the Battle of Vicksburg, which you can see right there. Okay. Which you'll notice is right upon the mouth of the Mississippi River. Okay. And as you can see here, the Union, guys, is also going to make a lot of headway to try to control the Mississippi River. Now, a lot of you guys might be wondering, why would they want to do that? Well, think about it. The reason, I think, is pretty simple. They want to be able to control resources, right? If you can control that river, guys, you can control, it's almost like controlling airways today, highways. You're controlling the means of transportation and also the means of communication to an extent. Okay. So therefore, that's important. And so you notice, guys, what's the one general that stands out the most here for the Union Army? It's going to be Ulysses S. Grant. Grant is going to get a lot of very strong praise by Lincoln. We'll look at him a little bit more as we proceed to our next lesson, kind of like that point between 1862 and 1865. Okay. And Lincoln, guys, makes it very clear to Grant, you know what? You're going to win this. You're going to do everything that you can within reason to do it. Okay. And guys, what do we notice? We're noticing that the North or the Union Army is gaining momentum in the West. Ask yourself the question, why would that be so important? All right. And the reason being, guys, is if you can gain momentum, you can shift the war. Which part, the Union or the Confederacy, has the population advantage? All right. We haven't even talked about that to an extent. But a lot of you guys should already know it's going to be the Union. All right. And both sides are going to resort to some conscription, which is a fancy way of saying basically draft or some bringing soldiers into it. Okay. So just some things with the geography to keep in mind. Okay. So we're not going to cover every single general. There's McClellan, a pretty young guy. There's Grant. And here is one of the most interesting generals during the war that you'll hear about. His name is William Tecumseh Sherman. All right, I'll share a story about him when we get to the Southern campaign next time or the time after. Okay. And then probably the most well-known, this is Robert E. Lee at the Confederacy, and this is Stonewall Jackson. Okay. So geography of the war, whenever we're talking about the idea of the maps, the East is mostly, for me, going to be places like Pennsylvania. Guys, the one thing to keep in mind, we do not see a ton of battles actually being fought on Union soil. And ask yourself the question, why? All right. And it kind of comes back to the idea of strategy by the Confederacy and also by the Union as well. Okay. But you'll notice, like Pennsylvania, Maryland remains a Union state, even though it did allow slavery. Keep in mind, it was a slave border state. Virginia, remember, leaves. South, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And then, all intents and purposes, guys, again, the West is going to be moving closer to that Mississippi River area. Okay. So the question is, guys, strategies. You might even want to pause for a second and ask yourself the question, how would these strategies and these advantages play into both sides of the war? Okay, so the Union, this is not in any particular order, guys, of importance. It's all significant. Okay, but guys, if you take a look here, you'll notice population numbers. Ask yourself the question, guys, railroads and transportation. Why is that so important? Weapons. If you can move, and guys, remember, the railroad is since the 1830s and 1840s, it is now being mass produced. Okay. Within 4 years of the Civil War ending, just to give you a quick note on this, guys, you're going to notice that we have an actual transcontinental railroad. Part of the reason for that is Union policy during the Civil War. We'll come back to that later. Okay. And then also factories and manufacturing. A quick story about Gettysburg that you might hear me tell again in the future is, why was it that the Confederate Army actually went into southern Pennsylvania knowing that their strategy was more defensive? One of the arguments was that they needed shoes. All right, they needed their army guys and their soldiers were lacking supplies. Okay, so therefore that's their advantages. Now notice, guys, I don't have leadership on there to begin. So we're kind of looking early in the conflict. So military experience, the South is going to have Lee, they're going to have Johnston, they're going to have, of course, some of the other people that we already talked about. Okay, Jackson, etc. Sorry about that. Okay, so they have a really strong amount of experience. Defensive war. Why is that important? What do we mean by that? Letting the enemy more so come to you. And then the morale. We have a way of life that parts of the rest of the country doesn't get, whether it's slavery, whether it's something else along the lines of being a Southern gentleman that means something different, doesn't matter. Okay, we have a way of life that is worth protecting against some kind of aggression. Okay. Now, guys, keep in mind, the majority of the Southerners do not own slaves. All right. But the ones that did are going to control a lot of the politics, a lot of the economics, of course, a lot of the wealth and power. Okay. So how does that impact strategy? Prepare and wait. Okay. We can just let them come to us. Okay. Fight a war of attrition. Every so often, you'll come across that term when you're talking about things like Vietnam, even the American Revolution, guys, to an extent. So really, what does that mean? You can look up the definition, but a really basic nuts and bolts explanation of this is, let's frustrate our enemy. Let's make them to where they start to kind of question, is this war, the resources we're losing, the manpower we're losing, et cetera, is the war really worth all of this trouble or whatever word you want to use for it? Okay. War of attrition would be, we're going to throw this out. All right. Now, as a lot of you know, that's not eventually what works. All right. I want you to think about why that might be the case. All right. And then also think about this, King Cotton. What do we mean by that? It's the importance of the cotton product to the world economy. All right. Because guys, remember, the Union already has an established Navy. Now, it might not be a great Navy, but it's already there. Okay. So they're going to blockade, as we'll see, guys, here in a second with this Anaconda plan. They're going to basically blockade all of the different areas that are along the southern coast. That's the Atlantic and also the Gulf Coast, the Gulf of Mexico. And it's really going to do a pretty big toll on a lot of southern trade. Okay. It also almost leads to a war between the Union and the British too, but that's a story for later. Okay. So what options can they have? Well, you have a pretty well-known general in his day, Winfield Scott, who, by the way, is a veteran. He's not a new general. Okay. I want to say he fought in the Mexican-American War as well, as did many of these men. Okay. And so he comes up with this Anaconda plan. What do we mean when we say Anaconda? What is that? A constricting plan, kind of like the snake. And he makes the argument, guys, and he says, for a good reason, if we're going to basically defeat the Confederacy, we have to be able to blockade them. Now, guys, think about what that word means. Blockade. Yeah, nothing gets in, nothing gets out. So you're basically controlling about everything as far as trade using waterways. That's another reason why the Mississippi River, guys, was so essential. Okay. So yes, it's about the Atlantic Ocean. Yes, it's about the Gulf of Mexico, but it's also about, guys, controlling that area as well. Okay. You also cut them in half if you can control the Mississippi River. And then last but not least, kind of like the concept of capture the flag. If you can capture the capital, then pretty much, guys, you're going to have a good chance. Now, an interesting story. Remember, Virginia is not the original, Richmond, Virginia is not the original capital of the Confederacy because Richmond is in Virginia. And remember, guys, Virginia was one of the last 4 states to leave. So Montgomery, Alabama, which is one of the earlier 7 states, is actually going to be the first capital. And then they eventually move it, okay, to Richmond. All right, let me show you the geography, guys, of Richmond so you can actually see this. Okay,